Hello, today I'm going to show you how to actually use some of Workbot's functionalities, which includes buttons, block kits, and dialog boxes. We'll learn more about these by building a feedback bot. In this video, I'll assume that you already know how to create a custom bot in Slack and have it connected to Workato. Otherwise, do read up on that first. Alright, let's start off with a demo of the end product that we'll be building and then creating it from scratch. This bot is going to allow users to prepare product announcements before sending it to a channel. A user starts by issuing a command to the bot, which the bot will then reply with a button for the user to get started with the entire process. In this case, my command is going to be select start announcement. The bot replies us with a button that we can click on to get started. This is where it prompts me with a dialog box that I can then provide more information about this announcement that I want to send out. For example, I can choose the channel, the product ID, and let's give it a title and a body. Capabilities, let me spell it correctly. Try it out. Okay, once that is done, go ahead and click on submit. It then comes back to alert me that it has posted my announcements to the magical announcements channel, which I've selected in the form. And over here on the left, you can see that there is one notification right now that I can see immediately over here. Announcement by myself alongside my title that I've created and the body of the message. What you see around the message that I've created as well is this header that the bot has automatically input for me. And then also at the bottom, the footer of the message, which asks users for feedback. And they're allowed to actually click on this button over here, which then prompts another dialog box, which comes back to ask for more information about this feedback that they're about to give in terms of what did you like about the feature, do you have any suggestions, and then your rating. And you can see over here, the first two are optional, but the last for the rating, this one is a required field. So I'm just going to fill some of these information out and we'll see what happens once that is done. Awesome. Build recipe form. Okay, and then I'm going to give it a rating of 5. Go ahead to submit. Once that is done, again, what the bot is going to do is that it's going to actually collect all of the feedback provided by anyone in this channel, and it's going to actually send all of the feedback to another channel that maybe this one over here, we can actually keep it as a private channel where only a subset of people are involved and where they have the permissions to actually read all of the feedback that were provided. Right? So over here, I currently only have myself inside of this channel with the bot. And so it is allowed to actually post all of this information into the channel that I can then collect from. Over here, you'll see that this is going to be again covered with the header. First of all, providing me context information about who is exactly providing feedback, what they provided in this section down below as well. So that's a demo of what we'll be building today. And now I'll actually be going into the Workato recipe to actually build out this entire recipe, starting first from the application over here, when we actually message or rather issue the command to the bot for select start announcement, providing us with this entire message, and then providing us with our button over here. Right. So let's go into the Workato platform. And I'll just be logging into my account. And then once we are into the workspace, I'm just going to actually create a new folder over here for the feedback bot that we are building today. And let's get started with creating a recipe. I'm just going to skip this section over here, which is the recipe wizard. We'll just go over straight into the recipe editor as it is, so that we can actually customize all of the triggers and actions from within this page over here. I'm going to first start off with actually setting my title for my recipe. Let's name it as /start announcement. So this is the command that I would actually like to actually have the user issue to my bot before I perform my set of actions over here. So for the trigger, we are going to actually select Workbot for Slack. And the trigger event over here is going to be new command. First of all, I have to link my account. So this is where I go in here. And for this demo, since I already have Optimus Prime installed with all of these commands, I'm going to use another bot, which I've already set up previously, and that is Bumblebee over here. So I'm just going to link my account up with Bumblebee. Now, first of all, as if you have already built several Workbot recipes yourself, then this section over here, this is something you'll probably be familiar with. This is how the three boxes over here defines the commands that Bumblebee then listens upon so that it will activate your recipe. So as mentioned, we would like it to have it listen for commands when the application is Slack, action is start, action data is announcement. When I click on the drop-down box over here, if I look for Slack, that is there, so I can click on that and use it. If the option that you are looking for isn't here, then you probably just want to actually enter a custom value, which allows you to specify any sort of value that you want as the application. For action, since start is not here, I'm just going to enter a custom value, and let's put in start. Announcement, I won't think that is here as well, so I'm just going to use custom value again. And then there are several other configurations that you can specify for the trigger event, one of which is command input fields. We don't need these for now, so I'm just going to skip this section. What we do need is the command hint, which is a required field. So I'm just going to say, let's just give a hint of this command prepares user announcements, right? And then there are again several other configurations down below. These are optional, and by default, we can just keep the values as it is. So that is the first part for when we have set up the trigger. Next is when we actually want to perform our actions over here. We would like to actually, first of all, let's do a simple reply, right? To actually check if the command that we have created for is working. So I'm just going to say, let's post a command reply, replying back to the user. And then there are several suggestions down below. We don't want to use that. Let's do it from scratch. So I'm just going to remove the suggestions over here. You'll see that when formatting your replies, there are a lot of different components that Slack has allowed you to do in terms of designing blocks, attachment fields, buttons, message menus. These are all functionalities that we'll be covering later on. But for now, at the very least, what we'll just be doing is to actually do a simple message text. Right? This one just gives me an input field for a simple text option over here. And then what I'm going to do in here, just to test that things are working, just going to say, I've got your command. Once that is done, we are actually ready to actually go ahead to start our recipe with this simple trigger and action that we have just built here. So I'm just going to click on start recipe. And then once that is started, we can go back into Slack. Going to Bumblebee, I can issue the command that we have just configured for. In this case, it is Slack start announcement. Right. And you see over here, Bumblebee then replies us with, I've got your command. So that indicates to us that the recipe that we have just created is working entirely. What we can also see in the jobs section is, let me just refresh the page. You'll see that there's one job that was completed, indicating to us that it actually received that one command that we just issued. What you'll see in the job report as well, if you're not already familiar with Workbot, is that there is a section for output, which gives us more about the context information about the user who issued the command and whether or not there were any inputs provided alongside the commands. We have not done that just yet, but later on we'll be exploring that portion in the parameters section. If there were any inputs, this portion is going to be populated. Right now that is empty. However, for the context, it will also provide us with the user information about who was the user email itself of the user that provided or rather issued the command, its user handle, and the username, right? So these are some information that we can use to actually perform in our command replies. So let's just make one simple modification to the actions section, right? Over here, we were just replying with I've got your command, but I also like to reply with maybe the username, right? To indicate that, hey, for this specific user, I've got your command. So let's go back into the recipe and let's make a modification. To do so, just going to have to stop the recipe first. Coming down into the actions section below, posting a command reply. In my message text, I also want to actually specify who the user was that invoked this particular command, right? So on the right is where I can see my data tree. And as I've shown you in the job report, there is a section for the context and there is a section for the parameters. Right now, parameters is empty, but at least from context, we can actually pull in several of the data fields that we have just seen. For example, the user is something that we can actually map into the message text. Oops, I've moved it into the wrong location. Let me just remove that. Move my cursor to the front and then click on this again. Let's put a comma and then again with the message text of I've got your command. So let's go ahead and get started with the recipe. And that's how you actually go ahead to actually go back and forth with modifying your recipe, adjusting the message text, all by coming into Workato, clicking on stop and start, making your necessary adjustments. So let's go back into Slack and let's repeat the command again. I'm just going to copy this and paste it in here. Yep. Right now you'll see that again we have a response, and this time around it isn't exactly what I expected to see. I was expecting to see Gabriel, I've got your command, but it instead responds to me with the ID of my user itself. So it seems like I've mapped a data field wrongly, and let's take a look at what I should be using instead. So if I come back into my recipe, again refresh the page, let's take a look at the second job that has just came in. So let's open up the job report, and over here in my actions, you can see that this was the user sort of data field that I was previously selecting from. And where this comes from is if I go into the trigger, going into the output and the context section, you can see that I specified user and the value that it evaluated to was this particular string. Instead, what I wanted was more of the username itself. So let's go back and change that. So I'm going to go back into my recipe. Again, first of all, stop my recipe. Coming into the recipe editor, going into my actions section below. This is where I'm just going to remove this user field, and instead we'll be using the username instead. So go ahead, get started. Once that is done, again, let's issue the command over here. And this time around, you can see that this is the correct response that I was expecting. So that's the first step for getting started with setting up a trigger command on Slack Workbot, posting some actions, which is a simple message reply for now. Of course, if we go back into our original demo for Optimus Prime, you'll see that when I actually send out the command, instead of just replying me with a simple text, it's going to actually reply me with this message over here alongside a button. So let's take a look at how we can actually provide this same button to the user as well. Coming into our recipe, let's stop the recipe and make modifications in our command reply. And if you see over here, one of the section contains a button. So this is where I can go ahead to create the same button which I've just seen. So let's expand this view, and first of all, we can go ahead and click on add a button. Let's give it a button title, and over here, Where this is reflected is, again, if I come into Optimus Prime, this is my title for Let's Get Started. So I'm just going to use the same title as well. And what you'll see as the next option over here is that you need to actually specify a submit button command. And what I can see from this list is a list of other recipes that I have that the bot is then going to actually send the context information about this button click to the next recipe itself. So how it all works in terms of the anatomy of the Workato recipes and working with the different buttons is that it's going to actually send each button click into a recipe that you have to define. So if you're not sure of that yet, I'm just going to go into docs and show you where that is. Right, so if you come into the docs, let's take a look at Workbot for Slack. And then over here, we have the advanced topics for the buttons itself. Workbot buttons. And let's take a look at the anatomy of the button. What you'll see over here is where we are at is recipe 1, which in one of the actions, we have decided to publish a button. What it allows us to do is it allows us to create a button, but it has not allowed us to actually collect information about that button click. So that is where we need to go into recipe 2 to actually allow us to actually perform several other actions when the button is clicked. So I'm just going to go back into my Slack workspace to actually create this second recipe, which acts as the trigger for the button click. So coming back into Workato, just going to save the changes over here for now because we are just going to be not able to actually configure this section until we've created the second recipe. So I'm going to actually open up a new tab. And over here, what I want to do instead is let's go back into the same folder that we had originally and let's create a new recipe. Skip this section again. And this time around, we are going to create our second recipe. So this is for, let's put it to maybe select start announcement, but maybe this is our part 2. So I'm just going to append 2 to that command itself. Again, what I'll need to define in that trigger is Workbot for Slack. This is again going to be a command. Essentially, all of the button clicks are commands themselves, other than specifying that as a sort of a string over here. So I'm just going to set new command. Again, what I need to do is just link my account and set up my 3 keywords for my command. It's going to be similar with the exception of the last portion where it's instead of announcement, it's going to be announcement 2. Over here, again, let's say the command here, this is to receive the button click from, let's say, select start announcement. So there we have it. We have set up a trigger which listens out for the button click. And in terms of the actions, let's again do a simple test for now, where we are just going to actually post a simple message reply with this action over here. Again, we're just going to remove all of these suggestions. We're just going to define them ourselves. So message text. And over here, to indicate to the user that we have received the button click, I'm just again going to use some context information, username, and I've received your button click. Oops. Okay, once that is done, we can go ahead to start the recipe. And this is now listening out for whenever the command select start announcement 2 is invoked. Of course, coming back into the anatomy, we have set up recipe 2, but what we now need to do is go back into recipe 1 to actually configure or rather hook up the button click such that it invokes the trigger on recipe 2. So if I come back into my first recipe, what I can see over here is that if I come into the buttons section, the recipe that I've just created has not appeared here. What we can do is just go down to the bottom of the page and do a schema refresh first. And then once that is done, we can come back up, submit button command again, and then we can see that this recipe has now appeared. So I'm just going to select that, and we are going to actually save all the changes that we have made and go ahead to start the recipe. Just to recap what we have done so far is we have created the first recipe with the button, which is then going to hook it up into the second recipe. And then what it does over here is to reply us that it has received our button click. So to test all of that, let's go back into Slack and let's go back into Bumblebee to actually invoke that command. So Slack start announcement. Over here, you can see that now, apart from sending the message text that we have just created, it also provides us with a button for let's get started. So I'm just going to click on that. And over here, you can see that this is a message that we have received. And where this message originates from is simply the second recipe that we have just created. So that's how we can actually hook up some of the buttons in Slack to different recipes itself. And later on, as you're going to more advanced functionalities, what you can see over here is if I come back into my first, I have created just one button for now. But of course, you have the option to actually create as many buttons as you want that links it up to many different kinds of recipes. So that is for you to actually explore yourself when you actually want to make a bot command more powerful, right? In terms of, or rather more comprehensive in terms of covering many other kinds of options that you can provide a user as well. For now, I'm just going to be happy with one button over here. All right, now that we have created our button, what we can do next is let's also going back to Optimus Prime, take a look at what this button behavior is supposed to do. When we click on let's get started, it is of course going to actually prompt us with a dialog box specifying different options that we can choose from, right? First of all, the channel is a pick list indicating all of the different available channels that I have in my workspace. And then product ID, title, and body. These are just simple message options for you, or rather input fields, with the exception that the body is a much longer sort of space that I can create as well. So let's take a look at how we can actually request for some of these input fields on the Workato recipe. If I come back into Bumblebee, you can see right now my button is pretty basic, where if I click on the let's get started, it's just simply going to actually reply us with a message over here. So this is where we then need to actually go into the second recipe to actually make some modifications. Let's first of all stop the recipe on the second one. And then coming into the recipe section, trigger is where my command input fields are going to come in handy this time around. Over here, this section allows me to actually collect some information that I want from the user. So let's go back into Optimus Prime. These are the fields that I want to collect from the user. I have channel, so let's add that in here. Add a command input, and let's name it channel. Over here, you can see that there are several configurations. By default, if you keep everything as it is going to simply give you a sort of an input field like you see for product ID. But for channel at least, we want to be able to choose from a pick list of channels. So this is where Slack has also given us that option. We can go down into the dialog control type and select select option instead. And the options for this select type is going to actually come from the channels. You can also select from other items. For example, if I set it to users, what I'm going to see over here is the list of available users in my workspace. Or if I can also specify a static field that I can define my own sort of options. And we'll see this in the later part of the dialogues that we'll be building. For now, I'm just going to set it to channels. And let's go ahead to add this as a field. So that's one. And then what we're just going to be doing is to repeat for the rest of the input fields for product ID, title, and body. So I'm just going to add those. Product ID, You can see over here, no spaces allowed, so I'm just going to actually replace the space with an underscore instead. This one, we can keep it as it is a simple text view. Then we have one for title. Again, I can keep all of the settings over here. Finally, we have one for body. And if you've seen previously, the only difference is this is a large text area. And what we can configure that is over here in the control type. Instead of text, we'll set it to a text area. So go ahead to get all of my views. And what I'm going to show over here is before we do any sort of sending of this entire announcement to another channel, we're just going to actually coming back into our command reply, just indicating to us that we have just received the parameters correct. So I'm just going to specify that in here. I'm just going to say that your inputs are, and then I have channel, I have my title, I have my body. Oops, I have one more for product ID. And then I'm going to actually put in several of these data fields. Again, where you can find it is on the right. This time around, you'll see that the parameters section over here, these are now populated with the command input fields that I've just defined. Right. So I can specify over here, I want channel. I want to specify what the product ID is. I want the title, and I want the body. So let's go ahead, get started again, and see the differences in our recipe this time around. So let's go back into Bumblebee. And let's click on the Let's Get Started button. And you can see over here, there you go. I have my 4 options, the channel, which I can select from any item within here, product ID, title, as well as my body. So let's go ahead to actually specify one channel, 001. Let's say this is my product ID, title, Bumblebee, build 1. Testing this out. Let's go ahead and get submit the form. And what you see in here is now the response that the recipe has provided us back, right? It has collected the channel ID information, product ID, title, and body. So with all of these inputs, now I can actually proceed on to my second step. We now want to actually use all of this information to actually send it into the channel that we have just selected. In this case, I selected magical announcements, and this is how it should then populate a message in here for me. So now we are going to actually modify our second recipe, which has collected all of the information about the title, the body, and then we are going to actually have it send the message into this channel instead of just simply replying back to us that it has collected all of these inputs. Right? So if I come back into my second recipe, I'm going to stop this one here. And over here, I'm just going to keep this one now for command reply. We can clean it up later on. But what I'm going to do down below as my next action as well is to perform another action for a Workbot. This time around, instead of posting a reply to myself, I'm just going to actually use the post message option instead. What you see in here is that it's pretty similar to whatever you've just seen in command reply, but with the first addition for allowing you to specify the exact channel that you want to send a message to. So in this case, we have already collected where the message ID is from this section over here. We are going to use the channel data field to actually send a message there instead. So if I come back up into my first step, which is where the command was issued, and which is also where I've collected all of the inputs from, I'm just going to click on that, going down into the parameters section, and this is where I'm going to select channel as my data field. Next is where I want to actually design my message with BlockKit's design that I've seen as part of my previous demo. Right over here, this is an example of what we can have as a BlockKit. What you see different from the normal kind of messages is that it allows you to actually populate with dividers as the lines that you see in here, and then messages with buttons formatted to the right of it. So let's take a look at some examples. We can see blocks is what we'll be using. we can also see some previews that Slack has provided us in this link over here. So over here, coming in here, I can select a template, and let's take a look at some examples, right? These are all samples of what we could potentially use block kits for and how we can actually format our messages in these formats itself. So there's one for approval, which consists of several few key value pairs alongside a link, and then finally with a approve or deny button. And then coming below, I also have one more template for notifications, where I can specify multiple line items with multiple buttons that a user can pick from. And then there are several other more different kinds, right? They can see over here. And these are all block kit designs that you can actually use and customize in Workato, similar to whatever you've just seen over here. The one that I've picked from is similar to the one that we are seeing over here in the notification section, where we are going to actually provide some information in the title and body in this block over here. And then there is one line below that pretty much allows a user to give feedback, right? So instead of 3 buttons, I'm just going to have 1 button for today that we'll be building in our recipe. So let's go back into the recipe editor and let's explore the blocks section over here. So I'm just going to expand the block views, and over here, I'm just going to design our message with the first block. What I can see over here is that you can choose from many different kinds of blocks, section with text, images, buttons, views, so on and so forth. For my first section at least, I'm just going to actually choose from the section with text. And if I take a look at my formatting previously, I have this portion, announcement by the user itself, as my first block. So I'm just going to design that similarly in this portion here. Announcements by, and then we have the user over here. And if you can see over here, I've done some special formatting for my messages, whereby the user value over here is something that's clickable, and then there is also an emoji over here. Simply to actually replicate that entirely is that I can actually go to my emoji section. Let's look for this one here is a confetti ball. I'm just going to take that. And if I highlight over this portion and then I copy this and paste it into the recipe editor, you'll see that this is simply this text over here. So later on when I post this message, it's going to actually translate this section into an emoji that I have in my Slack workspace. And several other differences that you'll see in terms of text formatting over here is that announcement by, this is in bold and this one isn't, right? So you have to use some markdown formatting. Over here, Workato does support markdown. You just have to specify it according to what Slack wants it in. So let's go into Slack markdown documentation just to see what that looks like. Documentation, formatting text in messages. Over here, let's read the reference guide. And you can see that these are all the options that we can choose from. First of all, if I want to actually bold my text, then let's pick from this option here. And it says that I simply have to actually prefix and postfix my text with the asterisks. So I'm just going to do that. Coming back into the recipe, just going to say announcement and putting the asterisks around the text itself, right? The second portion is also where this is a link that I can click on, and this is another kind of markdown formatting that I'm going to be using. It's like, right over here, let's go to the top, and we would like to actually perform the mentioning users section over here. So I'm just going to click on that, and how Slack wants that portion in is that it needs to actually come in this format, right? So I'm just going to copy this section over here. Coming back into our page over here, just going to paste that right before we close up the asterisks. So what you can see over here is that it needs to actually open up with the angle bracket followed by the @ and then this string that you are seeing over here is the user ID. Now, previously you have already seen in one of my examples where I've gone into Bumblebee and I mistakenly actually put that information in here, right? So this is the user ID field that we should be populating into our recipe as well, just in order to get that formatting working for us. So instead of this hard-coded string, just going to come back into the new command section. Where we can find that is in the context section. So we have the context, and over here, this is the user ID field that we want to use, right? So that's all we have for our first line inside of our block kit. Right. Oops, let's go into the announcements channel, and this is the first line that we have just created a block for. The second block that we have is a special kind of block, which is pretty much simply a divider. So this gray line that you see in here, if we also want to put that into our message, let's go ahead, click on edit block, select the type. This time around, there is one option over here at the bottom, which is called a divider. So I'm just going to put that as well. Then I'm going to actually create several other blocks over here. This one now, if you have understood what a block does, the rest of the section here is pretty straightforward. Pretty much what we're going to do over here is the title in bold, and then the body of the message in the normal font, followed by a divider again. So I'm just going to do that quickly, adding a block, section with text. Over here, we already know what the parameters are from the step 1. So I have my title and my body. Just going to put that in, followed by enter, put a body. Maybe I'll put a new extra line in between. Right, in the title, since I want that bold, just going to put the asterisk around it. And then we're just going to add another block for our divider. And then I'm going to add this last section for a text over here and then a button. Right, so I'm just going to copy this text, add a block. Over here, instead of section with text, we want a section with a button instead. The text message is this portion. The button is give feedback, right? So let's put it over here. Again, the button anatomy is that if we want to actually listen out for this button click, then it needs to actually route it to another recipe. We have not created that yet, so we'll just leave it empty for now. And then finally, what we can also do is we can specify the button style, right? Over here, you'll see that this button over here is in green. Previously, when we actually were talking to Bumblebee, the button is just in a normal sort of gray box. So Slack provides you with several options. Green is the primary option. And then if you want it in red, that is where you can choose danger instead. So I'm just going to set it to primary. Okay. Now I'm just going to start the recipe. Let's see if this works. There is an error while starting the recipe. Let's view the details. And it says that the value is required in my 5th block in the value sort of field. Right. So if I go down into the 5th block, you can see over here, we were actually missing out the submit menu option command just because we have not created a button, a recipe that listens out for this button click just yet. So I'm just going to save the changes here for now. And we will need to actually go ahead to actually build our 3rd recipe just in order to listen to that button click first. So I'm just going to come back in here. In my folder, I have 2 recipes so far. We're just going to create a 3rd one. Skip this section again. Just going to specify this as my 3rd recipe. So I'll just name it as Slack start announcement. And this is part 3. So just postfix it with 3. Again, in my trigger section, I have my Workbot, my new command, link my account to Bumblebee. For this tree section again, this is straightforward, so I'm just going to breeze through it. Slack start announcement part 3. Right. Command hint, feedback buttons clicked. And for now, since we're just going to be testing out this button, just going to create a simple reply again, and we'll just specify as Let me just remove the suggestions. And then I'm just going to give a simple message text as my reply. Say that I've received your feedback. Okay. Okay. Go ahead, get started with this recipe. So this is our third recipe that's listening out for whenever this button is clicked. I can come back into my second one and then address this error that we are just seeing over here. So to do so, just going down into the fifth block, we need to actually specify the third recipe. Of course, that isn't appearing just yet. I just need to actually go down and click on the schema refresh. Once that is done, come back up, and for our submit menu option command, I can now select the third recipe that I want to hook this button up to. So let's go ahead to get started. And once the recipe is started, now we can go back into Slack and do testing again. Right. So let's start from scratch. We have Slack start announcement as our first command. Once that is done, it's going to provide us with a button for let's get started. Coming back to our several fields over here. Just going to do this quickly. Submit it. And if it's all good, it will then send that channel an announcement with all the messages that I've just sort of created, right? Over here, you can see the announcement. We have successfully used some of the markdown formatting by bolding the fonts over here, as well as mentioning a particular user in here. And then I also have this section over here, which is my title, and then my body of my message, followed by the two dividers around the title and body. Finally, with the section with the button, and then allowing users to click on the button to give feedback. Right, so if I click on this, it's going to link into my third recipe, which for now, what it's just going to do is that it's going to say, I've received your feedback, thank you. All right, so the next part of the recipe, what we'll need to do is instead of putting the message over here, we are going to actually send it into another channel instead, right? Over here, I already have created a channel called product feedback, which this is where we'll like Bumblebee to actually populate with messages each time someone gives a feedback. And prior to this, we have already seen the Optimus Prime demo. The message format is going to be in the blockkit format again. It is going to consist of the user who provided the feedback, and then the middle portion is going to actually consist of all of the three input fields which we have just collected. What did you like about it, suggestions, and rating. The only difference over here is that for rating, instead of putting in the numeric sort of rating, we are replacing it with the emojis for the stars over here. So if a user would actually give a rating of 5, then there will be 5 stars. If 3, that will be something like the one above here. Right. So to do so, let's go into our third recipe to make some modifications. Coming back in here, just going to stop the recipe first. And for posting of the command reply, this time around, what we want to do instead is that we would like to actually just want to thank the user for providing their feedback. So I'm just going to modify this text section over here with thank you for your feedback. Right. And just because this channel that we are using is in a channel which probably has a lot of people inside over here, we don't want Bumblebee to actually send that thank you for your feedback sort of message to everyone in this particular channel, right? We only want to actually give a message that is only visible to the user who actually clicked on the button. Just like how you can see over here above, I have a command cancelled message from my bot. This portion here, it's only visible to me. That means to say anyone else inside this channel will not actually be able to see this message. So likewise, I want to be able to actually populate thank you for your feedback that is only visible to the user who submitted. To do so, what I can do is go into the third recipe again, and there is one option that you can choose from within this configuration settings. If I just scroll all the way down, I can go into add or remove optional fields, and then I can look for the reply only to user option. So that's over here, send only to user. Just going to check that and apply the changes. And you can see this is one option that we can now toggle, and I'd like to put that to yes. Right. So that's the first part. And then the second part is where we now need to add in the other action, which is to actually send the message into the other channel that we are going to collect feedback from. So I'm just going to add a new action, again using Workbot for Slack. This time around using a post message option instead, removing all of the suggestions. Let's configure it from the start. For channel, I can either choose from a data field if I know what the channel ID is. However, if I don't, I can actually go into the select from list portion and select a channel over here that my current Bumblebee bot is a part of. And for this case, I'm just going to actually put that to product feedback. Right, so that's the channel that we have selected. Next, we also need to design how we would like to actually populate the message. Right, over here, we are going to again use block kits for our design, expand this portion, and then add a block for it. Let's take reference from what we have so far. So if I come back into Slack, you can see over here in the feedback channel. First of all, I have the title, which includes the user who provided the feedback alongside these information. And the final portion is where we were previously collecting what the product ID is. And the reason why I'm using this portion is just because if I go back into the announcements channel, you'll see that over time, many people are going to actually be using the different announcements over here. And if they were to actually provide a feedback, which then sends it directly to the feedback channel without indicating which product it is for, then it's going to be confusing for us to actually read these feedback later on. So I'm going to actually use this as my product ID label. So let's do the first part over here first by going into the recipe. So for my first block, it's just going to be a simple section with text. Again, for my formatting, to actually provide this portion in here, I'm just going to copy this section here, paste it in. Of course, this one needs to be in the format that allows us to actually mention other users. So it's going to be in this format, followed by the user ID in between the angle brackets, where I can get the context information about whoever provided the feedback. That again is going to come from my first step, the output of the submission of the feedback form itself. So that's where I can come into the context portion, and then I'm going to be using the user data field, which contains the user ID. Over here, this is where we would need to actually indicate what product ID this is for, and we have actually not sort of implemented this yet. Right? If I go down into my parameters section, what you'll see over here is that all we are collecting from the parameters are just the information about what the user liked, the suggestions, as well as the rating. What we have not collected so far is the product ID. So to do so, I'm just going to go back up into my trigger. Coming into the command input section, I'm going to actually add a field here for product ID. Now, there are actually a couple of configurations that we'll need to actually change in this section, but I'll go through this in just a bit. For now, I'll just leave it as the default settings. So go ahead to add your field, and then if I come back down into my message, here I can now specify which product ID this is for. So I can put a star here, and then I can actually go into step 1 of my output. Again, under the parameters section, this is where now the product ID is being populated with, so I can put it inside of here. All right, and the next portions, these are the standard fields that we have already seen in our block kits in the previous channel itself. So I'm just going to breeze through at least for the section over here, and then rating portion, we'll come and take a look at how we can actually transform the user's rating into the number of stars that we are seeing in here. So I'm just going to add a block. First one is my divider, so I'm just going to use that. Then followed by that is my section with text again. me just take reference from what I have previously. So I'm just going to copy this entire section, paste that in here. This one needs to be bold, so I'm just going to again wrap it around with asterisks. This one here is based on a user input, so that's coming from the section over here. Let's just leave a new line. For suggestions as well, I'm going to wrap it around with the asterisks to bold it. This one is the parameter. And for the rating itself, what I'm going to be doing is I'm just going to actually put the headers in here, so rating. And then for the bottom portion, I'll just leave it out for now, just because I want to add a new block below for another section with text. And this time around, I just want to actually specify the number of stars over here. So to do so, first of all, I need to know what the emoji text value of this portion is. So I'm just going to copy 1 star from here, paste this in. You can see this is the text version of the emoji. And just because I know what the user rating is from the parameter over here, this one can be value from 1 to 5. What I'm going to be doing is I'm going to actually convert this into a formula where I'm going to multiply this text with the number of times the rating value consists of. So to do so, I'm going to actually toggle this to formula mode, and I'm going to wrap this around with double quotes indicating that it is a string, and then we're going to do a simple multiplication with the asterisk and then the rating score over here. So that's going to populate for me the number of stars based on the rating. And let's take a look at how all of these looks like when we start our recipe. Before I do that, let me just go back in here. And the last portion is we also have a last divider for this block. So I'm just going to put that in as the last block. So that's my divider. And once all of these are done, let's go ahead and test this functionality again. First of all, to recap, we introduce a new parameter in here for the product ID, which we'll then be using for our message action on step number 3. So let's go ahead and get started. And then we'll come back into the Slack workspace over here, going into the announcements channel. Just going back into where Bumblebee last left off a message. And this time around, I'm going to try the give feedback button once again. So over here, you can see that there are now the same fields that we have previously defined. However, there is also another field here which mentions about the product ID. This field over here was previously defined when the user requested an announcement to be sent into this channel. In actual fact, I don't actually want this product ID value to be over here, but I like to actually parse it along, right? So later on, we'll see how we can actually do that. For now, I'm just going to actually populate with some dummy value over here first. Okay. Rating, let's put it 4 and let's submit. And if I go into the channels, product feedback, you'll see over here, this is my entire message. The user who provided the feedback for the product ID that we have specified alongside the content, and then you have your rating with the number of stars based on our formula. So coming back into this section where we are going to talk about product ID next, over here, if you recall, going back into Bumblebee itself, if I were to click on Let's Get Started, this product ID is something that I would have populated from within here. And this is something that I don't actually want the user who is giving the feedback to actually come in there and manually change the product ID, right? That's going to mess up my workflow. So let's take a look at how we can actually auto-populate this option into the feedback button. So to do so, let's go back into the second recipe where we are actually collecting the product ID from the user. So if you recall, if I go into the trigger for the second recipe, this was one of the common input fields, product ID over here. So what I can do is I can actually use the information that the user has actually provided in here in this parameter field in my button that I'm actually going to actually be providing to users to click on later on. So that's where I can come down into the post message section on step number 3. And let's go down into the buttons section. Over here, you can see that this command is going to link up to my third recipe. What I can do, besides providing the button, is also to specify some of the command input values. So this allows me to preview some of the values so that the user doesn't have to do it. In this case, I'm going to actually put in product ID, and we just need to keep the format over here is in the example. So it's going to be your key colon the value that you want to populate it with, right? So we just need to keep this in the same format that the third recipe is expecting us to provide. So it's going to be product ID colon, and then on the right is where I actually want to map from the parameters from my first step. So coming in here, let's minimize the context. Let's go into parameters and let's populate with product ID. So now that is done, what we are doing is essentially passing on the product ID value along to the third recipe. And let's see how this comes into effect when we try out the recipe. So let's go ahead and start this. So I'm just going to actually use select start announcement. Let's get started. Then I'm just going to quickly populate some of these values. Let's put 003, 008. Yes, 3. Right, go ahead and get submitted. Once that is done, it's then going to send that announcement into the channel over here. You can see everything stays the same. This time round, if I were to actually click on give feedback button, what you'll see in here is that the product ID is now automatically populated for me with this field that the user has set. The next thing that I want to do is I probably don't actually want to show this entire field to the user. I don't want to allow them to actually come in here and potentially make a modification, changing some of the values that will then affect how I view this product feedbacks later on. So let's take a look at how we can actually change that by going into the third recipe, which controls the inputs for this form to actually make this invisible to the user. So let's go into the third recipe. And in here, I'm just going to stop the recipe once again, go into the recipe section. And if I come down into the product ID portion, let's modify this. And this is where we can now change some of the settings in here. One area that we can change is by actually configuring the optional field. If I were to actually put this as a yes, then it's going to actually give me one other option where it says that if this is an optional field, do you still want to actually prompt the user for this input? And if I select it as no, what it would do next is the next time the feedback button form is sort of produced, it's not going to show this as an input field to the user, but it's still actually going to be collecting my product ID just because I've set that in the second recipe itself to actually parse that along as one of the input parameters in my button over here. Right. So I'm just going to do that by setting it to yes and then prompting no. So let's save the recipe once again and let's go ahead to get started. So let's see the effects of this by going into select. Let's close the dialog box over here and let's try the give feedback button once again. So this time round, when I click on give feedback, you'll see that product ID has now gone missing. But let's see if the actual product ID value is still going to be passed along into the feedback channel. So I'm just going to actually populate with some information over here. Let's give it 2 stars, right? Submit. Let's go into the feedback channel. And this time around, what you see in here is that all of the information has stayed the same. However, this is the product ID, which I've moved from recipe 2 into recipe 3 without having the user to actually, in the feedback button itself, populate that particular field. So that's how you can actually parse information between recipes in the backend itself. Let's take a look at how we can actually invite more people into this channel so that they can also give their feedback. Coming in here, just going to invite one other person. Let's invite Jon Snow into this chat. And what I'm going to do next is to switch into Jon Snow's account so that we can see what he sees on this page itself. Alright, and now I'm logged in as Jon Snow, as you can see over here, and this is what I see on the Magical Announcements channel. Right. There was an announcement by Gabriel, and then if I go ahead and click on Give Feedback, it'll tell me that it thanks me for my feedback, and that is all from me. Right. Going back into Gabriel's account, over here I'm logged in as Gabriel once again, and if I go into the product feedback channel, this is where I can also see that Jon Snow has also actually provided feedback for me with these messages. So that's how we actually build out the feedback bots with the 3 recipes over here. Let's take a recap. We have our first recipe, which listens out for Slack start announcement, providing users with the button. Once they click on that and put in all of their information about the announcement that they want to send to, that goes ahead to activate the second recipe, which posts the message into the channel. It also provides users with a feedback button, and once clicked on, it will then prompt the third recipe, which will collect feedback information, which will then post it into a separate channel again. So with this demo that we have built out today, I hope that explains to you how we can actually use the different Slack functionalities, which includes buttons, block kits, as well as dialog boxes, to actually handle scenarios such as these. In the next videos, we'll also explore more about other Slack functionalities, which includes Slack shortcuts or slash commands. So stay tuned.